The material in this video is legal notice and evidence of crimes. There is no statute of limitations on fraud and murder. Anyone interfering with the presentation of this notice and evidence will be guilty of aiding and abetting crimes against the biosphere and giving aid and comfort to the perpetrators. Some material is based on the work of Edgar March Cruikshank from his 2 volumes of History and Pathology of Vaccination, 1889. No references are provided other than access to that book because everything presented here is able to be independently verified by a 3rd grader. The practice of vaccination is not a science-based system, but a superstition with the official seal of governments, making those governments complicit in fraud and murder as acts of state-sponsored terrorism. There are no higher authorities than the individual, except for armed thugs and armies using lethal force. Hello, tubers! This is Pat Jordan coming to you from the vaccine ghetto in Illinois. You will have noticed that my first in this series of Hoaxxed had no foul language in it at all. That was monstrously difficult for me to do. I did type in the bad words and then I backspaced them out because as a deposition against Crimes Against the Biosphere, I wanted it to have at least a patina of decorum, much like Edgar Cruikshank's books History and Pathology of Vaccination, where the facts were simply laid out in a genteel fashion. That is what the world at large wants, nice friendly sound bites of how they are being assassinated. But it didn't do a damn bit of good in 1889 now, did it? So here we are in 2019 with the 5th installment of Exhibits A through Z of a biological warfare trial. And the absurdity is so through the roof that I won't contain my contempt or my language because, quite frankly, if you aren't angry, then you've got no business breathing. Patrick Jordan, that would be me, in the absence of anything that makes sense, was forced to come up with a meme that forces sense to be made of any given topic. Say it like it is, then there is no debate. A corollary to that is science language must be precise or it ceases to be science. The Navy SEAL put a seal on the envelope that he sealed to the back of a seal to be delivered in a Marine fashion to a Marine. What is the precise definition of the word seal? What is the precise definition of the word Marine? Where the superstition of vaccine falls apart and can never be put together again is in the language. The whore that is current science tells us that there is such a thing as a smallpox vaccine. This is untrue. If pressed, then the lying sacks of shit will backpedal and explain, as if talking to children, that it is a vaccine against smallpox. They will then smugly outline that it was developed from cowpox, which is the very heart of the lie and from which charges against them for fraud and murder can never be excused. If we call it like it is, then there is no debate. There is no smallpox vaccine. Never was, never will be. Words have meaning. The history of it is that when variolation was brought to England in 1721, they had no clinical laboratory science. Start with that reality. You are at the mercy of whatever schmuck, and most of them were Yahudim, determined to be smallpox on another human being so that they could gather the pus from a wound and then scratch it into another human being. Thing of it is that these schmuckers had a hard time telling the smallpox variola from the great pox syphilis. If that wasn't bad enough, then in 1767, Edward Jenner's mentor, Fellow of the Royal Society, John Hunter, who later went on to become Surgeon Extraordinaire to King George III, couldn't tell syphilis from gonorrhea. Johnny Boy wanted to vaccinate himself against syphilis, but he cut gonorrhea on the head of his own penis. Hunter died of hardening of the arteries, which is not unexpected given the disease he gave himself out of total ignorance. Now, I will be forcing my issue of saying it like it is, like pushing a puppy's nose into its own poo until people get it. Here we have a total loser who was surgeon extraordinaire to bloody King Georgie, and he couldn't tell one disease from another. So, with all the abandon of an entire fleet of drunken sailors in Her Majesty's Navy, how in the goddamn fuck could they possibly know that strange pus from strange people or animals had smallpox, chickenpox, that was often mistaken for smallpox, swine pox, goat pox, sheep pox, cattle plague, cattle measles, which is rinderpest, scabies, or syphilis, let alone cow fucking pox? I say cow fucking pox, not only to be gratuitously cussing, which I am wont to do, but because quite often they would scrape said pus off the pussies of cattle. Say it like it is, and there is no debate. So, for the sake of argument, what if there was no state-sponsored terror in the form of inflicted bioweapons under the armed threat of the state? You have to do this shit yourself.
Honey, could you go out to the barn and get some pus from the cow's pussy to scratch into our newborn? Stop being a wuss. Just pick up her tail and get some pus off her vulva with a kitchen knife. I don't care if there's cow shit around the sore. That will just make it better for our pure pink baby that looks so angelic and precious.
Would you fucking do it? Don't answer that! The state of the world here in hell is such that I imagine that most of the denizens of hell would do it, post it on YouTube, and then even more ingenious motherfuckers would come up with ways to hack self-vaccination. Where are the fucking comments? I'm still on track, are you? I just established with citations to follow that the entire superstition of vaccination is based on nothing. Not science, not fact, no repeatable anything. It was a literal clusterfuck of pus, with the provenance of the ooze being untraceable back then to any causative agent and inseparable from any other agent since it was raw pus. And to this day, this is what Stanford, an institution that trolls and professional vaccine polluters should get a hard-on for, has to say about it. Vaccinia virus is a big mystery in virology. It is not known whether vaccinia virus is the product of genetic recombination or if it is a species derived from cowpox virus or variola virus by prolonged serial passage, or if it is the living representative of a now extinct virus. Vaccinia virus was used for smallpox vaccination via inoculation into the superficial layers of the skin of the upper arm. However, with the eradication of smallpox, routine vaccination with vaccinia virus has ceased. Recent interest in vaccinia has focused on its possible usage as a vector for immunization against other viruses. Much less virulent strains than those used for vaccination against smallpox are being developed for use as vectors in hopes of reducing the likelihood of the development of serious complications previously seen with smallpox vaccination. In this page, you will learn more about the very rare, though serious, complications that arose as a result of smallpox vaccination. This is one of those times when, in the middle of a completed script narration, I realize that I'm not doing this for me, but an audience that doesn't even have a sliver of my 19 years of uninterrupted data gathering. So when I completed the quote about the unknown virus that sat above a picture of the second part of that page that included complications of vaccination, I realized that folks have probably not seen the textbook horrors I have witnessed over these years of what vaccines actually do. It was then that the lists of what are called in medicine as vaccinal accidents needed to be part of this narrative with the picture, so that the full scope of what Jenner did can be a mind transfer from me to you with no presumptions that you already know what I knew and was about to gloss over. Here are the complications of vaccination. Progressive vaccinia, vaccinia necrosum. Progressive vaccinia is a severe, potentially fatal illness characterized by progressive necrosis at the site of vaccination. This occurred only in immune-compromised individuals with deficiencies in their cell-mediated immune systems. There were only about 1.6 cases of progressive vaccinia per million vaccinations reported. See the picture below for clinical manifestations of progressive vaccinia. Of course, I reject the statistics out of hand. It's coming from professional liars who have had centuries to perfect their lies. If I can direct you to the second of the Hoaxxed series, called Meet Dead Edgar, it stated clearly that cowpox had never gone away in England. The greedy farmers just covered it up so that they could sell pus and scab-filled milk to the cities. There is a maxim in law that if the character of a witness is corrupt, then so is their testimony. Eczema vaccinated. This occurred only in persons who suffered from eczema. Unvaccinated contact with a vaccinated individual was the usual mode of transmission. This is an unveiled admission that vaccines shed. In a national survey in the United States conducted after smallpox had been eliminated, there were 66 cases with no deaths among 14.5 million vaccinees. Total shit writing. Their English teacher should be imprisoned. Wait. This came out of Stanford. Okay, they meant it to be unintelligible. There were 66 cases of fucking what? Vaccine complications, as the title might suggest, or 66 cases of fucking smallpox among 14.5 million polluted souls. And they didn't die of smallpox acquired after vaccination? Or they didn't die from fucking vaccination complications? This is the heart of this deposition. There is no science here. There wasn't even English as a second language. Science language must be precise or it ceases to be science. I'm actually glad I pulled these horrors out of their hiding place to showcase how important language is. Generalized vaccinia. Generalized vaccinia was characterized by a vesicular rash that sometimes covered the entire body. This usually occurred 6 to 9 days after vaccination. The lesions usually resembled the initial lesion found at the inoculation site, but they sometimes varied in size. Generalized vaccinia was not associated with immunodeficiency. The rash was usually self-limiting and thus little or no therapy was administered. There were about 23.4 cases per million vaccinees. What this is clearly saying is that healthy people can get a full-blown case of vaccinia. Yet we already saw that no one knows what the fuck vaccinia is. Because I hate math, I ran the numbers. 1 out of 42,735 people get this. Pick a small city in America, and that means of the total population, you just won the pox lottery. Post-vaccinal encephalitis. Neurological complications were the most serious ones that occurred from vaccination with vaccinia virus. Post-vaccinal encephalitis usually occurred in patients over the age of 2. The case fatality rate was about 35% within a week of onset. In the United States, there were 12 cases, of which one resulted in death among the 13 million vaccinees. Again, I don't believe any of their stats, but let's take a look at the numbers. Fatal and 35%. Those were the odds if you got just smallpox. 12 cases out of 13 million puts it at 1 in a million. Better odds than being hit by lightning. And who out there that doesn't have bad luck would not identify with that 1 in a million might just be them? But you see, they always focus on the acute and mortal cases that were reported, by the way. What about autism after the smallpox shot? Accidental infection. Accidental infection of some part of the body away from the inoculation site was the most common complication that arose from vaccination with vaccinia. Ocular vaccinia was a common manifestation of accidental infection. Is that even a word? I smell something like they pulled that out of their ass. Because if you know microbiology, you know that once you get the goddamn shot, it's systemic. Sure, they pollute your arm, but you really think it's staying there, having a picnic? That it shows up as the need for a pirate patch because it ate your eye out is something that they wish didn't happen because it's kind of hard to miss. Unless you are wearing a double pirate patch. Ever wonder why your eyes were perfect as a kid and then you needed glasses? Let's get back to that virus that Stanford said was so mysterious. Stanford University has no goddamn fucking clue what vaccinia is. In the modern age of computerized gene sequencing, they have no fucking idea what the poison is, so how in the name of fucking sanity could Jenner or his crazed acolytes or anyone that followed him have any idea what it is? Let's go further. You don't know what it fucking is, you don't know what it fucking does, but you scratch it into everyone you can, and 200 years later, you're still playing with it to see what horrors you can conjure with it from the depths of hell. What that tells a third grader is that Stanford isn't interested in science. They are perpetrators of old lies and perpetrators of new lies. This is not a renowned institution of learning, but a mental institution for the criminally insane. If I, as an undegreed farm boy, can put this together in a manner that a third grader could understand, then those at the level of Stanford and all other universities, government agencies, and medical institutions are co-conspirators in a crime because they have no excuse to not know this. So we have a myth, a legend, that somehow someone was infected with the pus of a cow and that somehow that made smallpox go away. Yet they had no idea what was in the pus. They couldn't tell one disease apart from another, as if it mattered anyway, because they couldn't separate out all the other diseases from the pus. And because of this historical medical breakthrough, let that sink in. Some clinically, criminally insane yahoos and their goy henchmen want to do the same to you in an age of modern science where if you say it like it is, there is no debate, and if you call it by its name, then science would not only laugh you out of the room, but continue to laugh as you climb the stairs to the gallows for attempted murder. But that's just my synopsis of the situation. The trolls and their masters will want authoritative references straight from the horse's heels. From History and Pathology of Vaccination, Edgar Cruikshank, 1889. On the 2nd of August, 1797, Jenner wrote, "The simple experiment of applying the matter from the heel of the horse in its proper state to the nipples of the cow when they are in a proper state to be infected by it is not so easily made as at first sight may be imagined. After waiting with impatience for months in my own neighborhood without effect, I sent a messenger to Bristol, in vain to procure the true virus. I even produced a young horse, kept him constantly in the stable, and fed him with beans in order to make his heel swell, but to no purpose. By the time the pamphlet goes to a second edition, I hope to be able to give some decisive experiments. But no cowpox appeared in the dairies, and his researches were thus interrupted until the spring of 1798, when an outbreak occurred which afforded him the much wished-for opportunities for further observations. A mare, the property of a dairyman in the neighboring parish, began to have, quote, sore heels. In the later part of February 1798, the horse's heels were dressed by the farm servants Thomas Virgo, William Warrett, and William Haynes, who in consequence contracted sores on their hands, followed by inflamed lymphatic glands in the arms and axilla, and constitutional symptoms, shiverings succeeded by heat, lassitude, and pains in the limbs. Haynes and Virgo had both previously been successfully inoculated with smallpox, but Warrett had not had smallpox. I'm going to stop you there because there's no need to go on. No need to go on with the narrative, but we will. No need to go on with the history of vaccine fraud, but it has. Despite all of the rules of medicine and the theories of infection and immunity being violated in a single entry. Let us go see a man about a horse. Jenner, who was probably the inspiration for Looney Louis Pasteur trying to force rabies into animals where it wouldn't take, was so obsessed with his delusion that smallpox originated from the greasy heels of horses, did everything he could, including piss off the PETA people by torturing animals, to prove his false theory that did not work if you have two brain cells to rub together to make a spark by reading Jenner's own fucking words. It didn't fucking work. Did that stop this mass murderer from chasing his dream? Hell no! It made him, like all homicidal maniacs before him and after him, work harder. Now, Tommy, Willie, and Billy all got a case of the greasy heels. As we have seen in my first Hoaxxed video, what it was called and what it is can be Dermatophilus congoensis, bacteria, parasites, fungus, allergies, photosensitivity, bad nutrition, chemicals, drugs, and antibiotics, bad soil, or bad bedding. If you have been observant throughout my entire expose, then you will know that of the 9 things that could have produced the sores that were not from a virus, that there is no way of telling what those men caught to the point of really being damn sick. What is it that we do know? That they contracted a zoonoses from a horse and that it made them sick. Period. We are told that Tommy and Billy were variolated. This means that you walk up to a fellow villager and say, "Greetings, fellow villager. That is a powerful collection of suppurating sores that you have on your body that have the countenance of the pox and that is small. Might I be granted the privilege of scraping some yon pus from thine arms so that I might have scratched it into my companions?" Apparently, Tommy and Billy didn't die from this pus exchange. As a sober warning, I have been studying pornography and am narrating videos based on that. So the graphic imagery of pus exchange between men is rather mind-shattering for someone like me who has an extensive background in microbiology. I just figured that if I have to be mentally scarred, then I will inflict the same on everyone else. which, by the way, is exactly what happened to Edward Jenner. He was variolated just like Tommy and Billy, but it didn't go so well for Eddy. In fact, it fucked him up so bad it put him in a sick house, deathly ill, and after he was released, he was a nervous fucking wreck. They don't tell that story too often, do they? Well, I do, because you really need to check out my 4th installment of Hoaxxed, which is called Why? Number 2, Generational Abuse. So, what does that mean in the grand scope of things? That fast Eddy was variolated by unknown pus from strangers, that it fucked him in the head, that like any abused child, he will then visit the abuses he suffered on successive generations. So he did indeed variolate and vaccinate his own kids, and then proceeded, like any psychopathic homicidal maniac, to inflict his horror upon the whole fucking world. Say it like it is, then there is no debate. But what did we learn from this? That an unknown agent from a horse took down 3 men. That Tommy and Billy were variolated against smallpox, yet got deathly ill from the horse disease. Now wait just a fucking minute. If Jenner was right, even though he couldn't force horse grease into cow's tits, that smallpox arose from the grease, sounds like a bad restaurant special, then by the laws of vaccination, Tommy and Billy should have never gotten sick because they were already variolated against the smallpox. Game fucking over for the other side. Tommy and Billy were variolated. They were, in the words of vaccine polluters, protected from the scourge of smallpox. But Jenner said that horse grease was primordial smallpox. So the 2 men should have never gotten ill. I mean, my fucking God in heaven above, am I the only guy in like 221 years that ever got that? Has anybody ever said that in 221 years? Yet we are so far above this madness that to call out this error would put us in jeopardy of the trap that was already set by the liars. What the fuck was the disease from the horse? Answer. The only true and scientific answer is no one goddamn knows. Not even God. Not even Stanford. What the fuck were Tommy and Billy variolated with? Answer. The only true and scientific answer. No one goddamn knows. Not even God. Not even Stanford. See? Do you see? Because we are already 5 pages. Ooh, sorry. That's the old narrative. We are already 7 pages into this narrative of mine without a single fucking clue about what anyone is talking about. So to draw conclusions that if primordial smallpox came from horse grease, and if a couple of cowpokes were variolated, then they should not have gotten sick. It was my argument, but I led you into the trap on purpose. They shouldn't have gotten sick from what? What was in the horse pus? What was in the variolation pus? What disease did they get from the variolation? What disease did they get from the horse? See? Do you see? In the absence of all evidence, there is nothing but pure fantasy. I can make things up. They certainly have made things up. There is no record of clinical evidence. There is no way to know or verify any facts. Do you know what this is called? Fucking religion. Again, I would say that in a 3rd grade class or a court of law, did I just repeat myself? That these delusions would be laughed out all the way to the brick wall where the firing squad is waiting. Way too many people have been murdered in the name of religion, and I just slayed one of the biggest dragons in front of you with its own horns, and it is bleeding fire. Haynes was daily employed as one of the milkers at the farm, and the disease began to shew itself among the cows about 10 days after he first assisted in washing the mare's heels. Their nipples became sore in the usual way with bluish pustules, but as remedies were early applied, they did not ulcerate to any extent. And the fraud goes on. What do we know? We know that a horse and 3 boys came down with something nasty. We know that 10 days later, cows came down with something nasty. Other than temporal association and vectoring, what is it that we know? Not a goddamn thing. No isolated organisms, no gene sequencing, just vague tales of illness and superstitious association of those occurrences with what fits the confirmational bias of those who promote their sick cult. By the same token, doctors and nurses will murder infants and children with vaccines, but will swear that it wasn't the vaccine. Let me tell you something about fighting scorpion-style kung fu. You mirror the other opponent's every move. Guess what, you religious nuts? The sores on the cows weren't the disease that the cowpokes got from the horse. There, Jenner, strike 2. Your theory is dead in the water with true science issued by fiat. If vaccinators can kill kids with vaccines or destroy their brains, but it's never the vaccines, then the horse grease didn't make the cowpokes or the cows sick. It had to be something else. What did Crookshank say? That any number of these things could be? Well, he really surprised me when I read his first volume that the healing ointments that they used on the animals could cause the same kind of lesions that they were blaming on the cowpox. Your basic mercury and antimony would create sores. Go back to the first Hoaxxed video to see the list and citations of what it could have been. Syphilis, cattle plague, which of course is mycoplasma, cattle measles, which is rinderpest, scabies, parasites or fungus or bacteria or cowpox, or since all this madness is accepted into court record by default, which by my deposition puts all courts on notice of error, I will say, because I am creative and I have a wicked sense of humor, that for all we know, it could have been Cowmorgellons. Cowgellons. If courts will accept fraud as the basis of their decision that are whole cloth fantasies made up by mass murderers, then I say that it could have been easily Cowgellons. How do you plead? The cowpox was raging in several dairies, but Jenner confined his attention to this one outbreak. Whether it was the only one in which there happened to be a horse with greasy heels, we are not told. I want you to all realize something. The reason why I admire dead Edgar Cruikshank so much is his English subtlety. Cruikshank just casually lays out a verbal lancet up the penis of Jenner by merely suggesting that if there was an outbreak of cowpox among all the neighboring farms, then by Jenner's own theory, that has been debunked, by the way, to once again use the troll words against them, then there should have been greasy heels among all of the horses of all of the farms because Koch's postulates demand it. But as you've seen, the courts allow fraud as evidence and destroy people's lives with that fraud, so Koch and his postulates be damned. Jenner's mind was occupied with the opportunity of making a double experiment, inoculation of one child with humanized horse grease and of another child with matter from the cow's teats. With regard to the horse grease inoculation, Jenner says, this experiment was made to ascertain the progress and subsequent effects of the disease when thus propagated. The object of this experiment is thus clearly stated. Jenner had already condemned horse grease, for he had committed himself to the statement that it had been decisively proved that grease could not be relied upon as a protective against smallpox. Sorry, Edgar, Jenner actually condemned himself. He is a mass murderer. Pay special attention to humanized horse grease, because I will cut off Jenner's phallus and fallacy and put it on a skewer. The object of studying the progress and effects may have been a double one. First, to ascertain whether an attack of smallpox would follow. For Jenner was firmly of the opinion that the grease was the source of smallpox. It was after it was transmitted through the cow that it appeared in the modified form known as cowpox. This outbreak, therefore, afforded him an opportunity for testing his theories. He could inoculate one child with the matter of the grease and another with the matter of the cowpox and study the results side by side. And if he could experimentally generate smallpox in the one case and carry on cowpox in the other, what an interesting addition to his paper it would prove. Secondly, he may have wished to ascertain whether by successive cultivation in the human subject, protective properties would be gradually assumed by the horse grease virus. For his experimental purposes, Jenner selected a child 5 years old, John Baker by name, and on March 16, 1798, he took matter from a pustule on the hand of Thomas Virgo, one of the servants who had been infected from the mare's heels. Death to Jenner and his death cult. What did we just read that would not stand up in third grade or court? Jenner stated that he wanted to test the horse grease. Say it like it is, and then there is no debate. Science language must be precise or it ceases to be science. If you are setting out to test horse grease, but then you take the pus from a human, whether or not that human supposedly got his disease from a horse, you just violated the scientific method. Now, in all fairness, Cruikshank did show us that Nervous Eddy did indeed say that the horse grease didn't work. So he literally did test it as a primary source material, and it was an abject failure. But keeping with my say it like it is meme, if you take something that didn't work, put it into a human, then take the results of that to put into another human, you can't call the second generation unknown pus by the first generation unknown pus's name. I will hammer this precision of language because I know some top people don't get it. They're casual about calling it horse grease and cowpox when it is humanized unknown pus from a horse and humanized unknown pus from a cow. Seriously, if it was not defined that way in court and anyone stipulates to it by affirmation or by not screaming an objection and exception, then y'all have just drunk the Kool-Aid. Pus-flavored Kool-Aid, and in a nice pastel green. The imprecision of language, the lack of clinical confirmation, the cross-contamination of one impure strain of an unknown with the impure strain of another unknown are proof that Jenner's work is not based on science. Science is what the vaccine polluters and trolls argue are the foundation of vaccines. I've already covered in Hoaxxed #1 how John Baker died for your sins. John Baker is the kid you never hear about, only James Phipps. That's because Jenner killed John Baker, and like all good doctors, they bury their mistakes. Yet even after Jenner killed John Baker and the Royal Society rejected his paper on vaccination, Jenner kept up the madness spurred on by the bloodlust. Please familiarize yourself with the Baker murder. If you have to watch Hoaxxed #1 a dozen times, it is critical, because I will now show you an excerpt from a book co-authored by the tribal trio, Plotkin, Orenstein, and the Most High Evil Offit, who should be given all 10,000 vaccines at one time that he said an infant could get. Vaccines, a chapter by Susan and Stanley Plotkin, 2008. Cowpox was not a widespread infection. It appeared sporadically in certain rural counties of England. Well, alrighty then. If cowpox wasn't widespread, but Jenner said it was cow smallpox, then why were people afraid that smallpox was around every corner, especially in fucking cities? I mean, I'm sure that y'all have a cow parked next to your SUV in your apartment slot. Thus, the local wisdom that those who contracted cowpox, quote, did not take the smallpox, was not widely known. Jenner knew this village folklore because he had been an apothecary apprentice in Chipping Sodbury in 1768, where a milkmaid told him about the efficacy of cowpox against smallpox. Indeed, he discussed the possible associations between cowpox and smallpox with John Hunter when he studied under him in London in 1770 to 1773. For unknown reasons, Jenner did not return to the subject of cowpox/smallpox until 1796. Hey, nice try, Plotkins. Jenner was busy pissing around with pig pus, as we will see below, in 1789. There's your fucking unknown reasons. That, and as Cruikshank observed in my short video, Dead Edgar, there weren't any cowpox outbreaks for him to steal pus from. His first paper to the Royal Society on vaccination was rejected because his experiment consisted of only one person, not enough to establish a principle. This is where, if these lying criminals would just commit suicide, then there would be no need for trials and summary judgment. We know from Cruikshank exposing all three versions of Jenner's published inquiry and the discovery of his submission to the Royal Society that they, in a cover their own asses and distance yourself from the nutter move, rejected his fucking idea because he killed John Baker. His experiment consisted of only one person. I see dead persons. They're everywhere. But it did establish a principle that you can call yourself a doctor, kill people with impunity, and then export that death cult around the world. This casual dismissive lie, not even spin by the Plotkins, will be gobbled up like shit sandwiches by medical students worshiping their authorities, and then they will ask for seconds. The exhaustive analysis that Cruikshank did in 1889 and my surgical and brutal autopsies will not let this kind of Yehudi fraud stand. Within 2 years, he expanded his studies and proved that cowpox could be passed directly from one person to another, thereby providing large-scale inoculation against smallpox without depending on the sporadic outbreaks of natural cowpox. Okay. This is where you arrest the Plotkins, Orensteins, Offits, their publishers, and anyone connected with their book Vaccines on charges of fraud, malpractice, and intent to commit murder. I proved that you cannot take the unknown pus, run it through multiple humans, then take the end product of yet more unknown pus and call it goddamn fucking cowpox. God damn it. Person to fucking person. Listen to me. I don't like fucking shaking hands with sick-ass motherfucking human beings. Why in the name of sanity would I let some Yehud take pus from the animal they worship, hotbox it in a long line of humans, and then let them put it in me? Remember my meme? Say it like it is, then there is no debate. And I could teach this stuff to a third grader. Why my implication of Yehoods? Check the lineup of the authors of the book Vaccines, all Yehoods. Check the portraits of Jenner in John Barron's biography. One thing that I still have to do is assemble family albums of the 13 tribes. Jenner was an Eastern European Yehood if there ever was one. Son of a preacher man notwithstanding. The Ashkenazi Secretary of State Madeleine Albright claims she was raised a Catholic, so she never knew she was Jewish. I guess they never had mirrors in her house, which is in keeping with the legends of vampires. Jenner self-published the results in vaccinated in 1798. With this publication, he brought to the attention of the entire medical community the merits of inoculating with the relatively obscure animal disease cowpox to prevent one of humankind's deadliest scourges. Fortunately for the world, Jenner had the connections that Benjamin Jesty did not, and vaccination rapidly replaced variolation. By 1810, Jenner realized that immunity against smallpox was not lifelong, but he did not know why. Squeeze the fuck out of me? Where in the hell did that come from? First, since this was written by Team Plotkin, who are professional liars and doctors, did I just repeat myself? We shouldn't hold them to the standard of sentence construction that makes sense, just like Stanford. But when we do, because we must, then what the fuck did that mean? Jenner realized that immunity against smallpox was not lifelong. If we're talking about naturally acquired immunity to smallpox, you bet your sweet government retirement it is lifelong. Are they saying that Jenner's cowpox fiasco was having breakdowns and needed boosters? The concept of passages of the immunizing agent, transmission from one human or animal to another, was well formed, but in 1836, Edward Ballard called attention to the necessity of choosing new strains of cowpox for vaccination because the old strains were too weak from so many passages. This is what is called continuity in Hollywood. If we take something like TB, where the BCG vaccine was regrown 231 times in glycerin, bile, and potato medium over 13 years before it was tame enough to use without killing people, or the polio virus that was passaged in rats and mice 50 times before it was passaged in cell culture before it was used. But the Plotkin plotters seem to be saying that the pus pussied out after it went through a few humans. I guess that's better than getting something that went through rats and mice. Hey, are rats and mice kosher? He recommended that the lymph vesicle fluid be passed back through a calf to regain strength. Calves were soon being deliberately infected with cowpox so that sufficient lymph for vaccination would be available. The lymph obtained from cows soon came under scrutiny because at the time, arm-to-arm transfer was the primary method of vaccination. Concern had long been expressed that other diseases, such as syphilis, were occasionally transmitted along with the vaccinia virus. What I have been trying to emphasize throughout this entire Hoaxxed series is that the black magic spells of words has everyone in its thrall. The legend that I have destroyed is that Jenner used cowpox. The Plotkins support the ancient lie by saying that cowpox was what was transferred from a milkmaid to Jimmy Phipps, but if it came from a pus knob on the milkmaid's hand, then it isn't cowpox anymore, is it? Why in the name of science didn't they just get the pus off the cow's tit Because you're now reading a rewrite of their script where they are saying, gee, shit, the old cowpox that wasn't really cowpox but people pus has lost its mojo to protect against smallpox, so we better take cowpox from a cow, scratch it into a calf, and then take the fresh stuff and start scratching it into people so that we can take people pus again because we haven't learned anything from our previous masturbation sessions. Then we get the Yehudi Plotkin casual acknowledgement that everyone who deals with corporate America knows syphilis is a problem and we are working on it. Where might said syphilis come from? The original cow tit, the milkmaid, the hundreds of people who were vaccinated with humanized cowpox, unknown pus, or the new cow pus that was now scratched into a calf so that it could be scratched back into people? Occasionally transmitted? Listen, Mr. and Mrs. Dickheads, Lyda Matman said that syphilis is a pandemic. Check out my End of the Line series to see how many people had syphilis in the not too distant past. The Plotkins are not physicians, they are spin doctors. Around 1850, German scientists, following Robert Koch's recommendation, began to use glycerin to kill bacteria and preserve the lymph. That process made possible a ready supply of a stable vaccine of consistent potency. By the end of the 1890s, the use of glycerinated calves' lymph was standard everywhere and arm-to-arm vaccination was abandoned. I would like people to feel suitably impressed that I have been doing this shit for 19 years straight without a break. So when I saw the glycerin in this last reference, that I have a mind like a steel trap that snaps shut on the food source of BCG for the tuberculosis vaccine that had a taste for glycerin, bile, and potatoes. Hey, I feel hungry. But since I am now immersed in Lyda Matman's work on cell wall deficient organisms, then it becomes our duty to determine if Bobby Koch's glycerin treatment killed anything at all or just made a tasty glazed donut for more bugs to feast on. God, it's hard being me. I didn't comment in hoax number 1, but take a good look at the scarifying process that they used to infect the calves so that they could harvest pus, still unknown pus, to make your smallpox vaccine. Why the hell isn't PETA all over vaccine manufacture? Oh well, at least even pig gelatin vaccines have been declared kosher. If you will forgive my time jump from 1798 to 2008, a mind like mine knows no boundaries and continuum. So I saw no difference between Jenner's seminal lies with the ones that are still ejaculated today by his minions. Back to John Barron and the narrative we left off where he had just killed John Baker. Jenner considered that his former cases had so satisfactorily withstood the subsequent inoculation of smallpox that it was unnecessary to test all the subjects of these later experiments. He, however, inoculated William Summers, but the date of the operation and local results are not mentioned. All that we are told is that the system did not feel the effects of it. Really? Fucking really? Science? Science dictates that you would test your entire cohort with the smallpox challenge. Not just be so confident in your own psychopathic delusions as God that your co-god of cowpox somehow works because you say so. Religion, blood cult, lunacy, the very basis of modern vaccinology. And good God, the vagary of the language, the lack of attention to clinical detail. Jenner's notes, kid was okay. Hey, thanks, Eddie. The fate of the modern world rests on your good honor, you psychopathic homicidal maniac. 2 other children, Barge and Pede, were inoculated by his nephew, Henry Jenner, who reported as follows. On the 2nd day, the incisions were inflamed, and there was a pale inflammatory stain around them. On the 3rd day, these appearances were still increasing, and their arms itched considerably. On the 4th day, the inflammation was evidently subsiding, and on the 6th, it was scarcely perceptible. William Summers had been inoculated from the cow the same day as Baker. So if we were to interpret this the way it was presented, there was a disease on a horse. It made Tommy sick. Tommy's pus was put into John Baker. Jenner tried to scratch horse grease into cow's tits, but it wouldn't take. Jenner waited until Tommy, Willie, and Billy kind of maybe almost got the grease inoculated into the cow tits and then scratched the presumed horse-originated pus, at least this time from a cow, into even more kids. At least this is in keeping with his theory of horse origin and cowpox as an agent. But what do we know about the pus that was taken from the sores on the cow? Like everything else in this narrative, not a goddamn thing. So within the realm of the scientific method and clinical experimentation, what conclusions can anyone, including us, draw from this experiment? Not a goddamn thing. He became indisposed on the 6th day, vomited once, felt the usual slight symptoms until the 8th day, when he appeared perfectly well. From William Summers, the disease was transferred to William Pede after the manner of arm-to-arm variolation. So what you're seeing here, and you should have already alarmed on, having studied my work for some time now, is that Jenner continued to violate the scientific method by claiming cowpox was protective, then using the unknown pus from humans that had been contaminated with unknown pus from a cow, which invalidates his work in all court cases since 1798. From William Pede, several children and adults were inoculated. 3 suffered from extensive erysipelatous inflammation. From one of these patients, Hannah Excel, matter was taken and inserted into the arms of John Mark Love, Robert F. Jenner, Mary Pede, and Mary James. From Mary Pede, lymph was taken to inoculate J. Barge. Take a look at the way Cruikshank represented this. He was extremely intelligent. Equine means horse grease, indirect. On a presumption that the grease made it to the cow teats, he took cow matter, put it into Summers, and from Summers at least 9 people were contaminated with unknown pus. Every single fucking time you add a new petri dish of a human, you are raising the contamination by an exponent. That's bad enough from a public health point of view, but from a logistical and science perspective, it's just shit. It's not just shit science, and I have read a lot of papers that fit that bill. This is just plain shit, because there is no science to it whatsoever. If, and only if, Jenner was going to do this according to his goal of proving the myth of the milkmaid that even vaccine promoters say is a total myth, because Jenner never used that as the starting point, then the scientific method dictates that he had to use the pus from the cow on over 9 people individually. Anyone versed in logic and critical thinking would know that if a foundation is invalid, that all else that follows is invalid. We will revisit the arm-to-arm false vaccination of Robert Jenner, Edward's son, to see that there is controversy about the myths built up around that. Isn't it interesting that the child of the king of vaccination didn't even have a reaction to this unknown pus poison being scratched into him? Or so it's charted. Let's see what other things Fast Eddy crafted as word games for his publication. Besides adding fresh cases, the whole manuscript was carefully revised with regard to the horse grease theory. Jenner now felt himself in a position to speak more positively, for in referring to the possible transference of infectious matter from the horse's heel to the cow's teat, he substituted the words, "when this is the case," for "should this be the case." Several expressions are modified in his description of cowpox. In his paper, he had written that the pustules were, quote, seldom white, but more commonly blue, and generally surrounded by more or less of an erysipelatous inflammation, unquote. But the published inquiry reads, at their first appearance, they are commonly of a palish blue, or rather of a color somewhat approaching to livid, and are surrounded by an erysipelatous inflammation. And in the third edition of the inquiry, the word erysipelatous is omitted. Another instance of modifying original statements occurs in the description of the case of Sarah Wynne. The account of the original paper may be compared side by side with the revised version in the published inquiry. Now, if we turn to the symptoms described on the 8th page, we are referred to a footnote in which it is stated that these symptoms arise from the irritation of the sores and not from the primary action of the vaccine virus upon the constitution. The meaning of this correction is now apparent. Jenner's idea at this period was to provide a mild substitute for smallpox inoculation, and these severe symptoms described in the original paper as an essential part of the cowpox are now attributed to accidental causes. This system of modifying his original observations is adhered to throughout the paper. The sentence, quote, pustules which are the most disposed to degenerate into phagedenic ulcers, now reads pustules which frequently degenerate into phagedenic ulcers. Just in case you're not familiar with the phrase phagedenic ulcers, in Latin it means it ate a fucking hole in your arm. Hey, by the way, if you really want to know what it looks like, scroll back to that picture of the baby that had like the vaccine accident, the complications of vaccination. There's your phagedenic ulcer. But one of the most important alterations is the suggestion of spurious cowpox. Jenner was obviously referring in the original paper to the blister pox, though he does not name the disease. But in the paragraph inserted in the published inquiry, he used the term true cowpox for the first time, which leads the reader to suppose that the disease of a milder nature was a false cowpox. And at the conclusion of the paper, Jenner has no longer any hesitation on this point, but uses the terms true cowpox and spurious cowpox with a reference to the footnote which has been quoted above. I wish to insist on the gradual assumption of the existence of a spurious cowpox. The farmers and cow doctors knew nothing of the spurious cowpox. They distinguished from other eruptions such as blistered teats, a disease which produced troublesome ulcerations on the cow's teats and ulcerations on the hands and large glands and constitutional symptoms in milkers, and this disease they called the cowpox. Jenner was alone responsible for assuming the existence of two kinds of cowpox, a true and a spurious, and this assumption was extended on further observations to include not one but several kinds of so-called spurious cowpox. Anyone who has looked into the life of Frank Demarest, who was called the Great Pretender, would know that he was an ultimate con man to never try to muscle in on an established operation. Variolation was already a thing, so Jenner invented his own disease called variolated vaccinated, Since his scam wasn't working, which is to say that people were getting challenged by smallpox inoculation but still getting sick, so he invented an excuse for why that was happening. They did everything right. It was just that they used spurious cowpox. Even doctors and farmers didn't know what Jenner, Lord of the Cows, knew. Yeah, that's it, blister pox. But like Hitler and Bernays, if you're going to cover your ass, tell a whopper. There were many spurious cowpoxes. Now, in all fairness to a man who probably killed more people than Genghis Khan, Hitler, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Mao, and Stalin put together, this is one time when he was close to the truth. Haven't I been saying all along that they couldn't tell the difference between smallpox and the great pox, syphilis? Haven't I been saying all along that if you take unknown pus wholesale from a human or animal, you don't have a fucking clue what's in it? This was Jenner's mea culpa. Yet did his admission of total incompetence shut him down? Did his opponents use it as an accusation against him for malpractice? Did the Royal Society or the royalty or Parliament demand an accounting? Not only no, hell no! They were all in on the fraud. In a subsequent publication entitled The Origin of the Vaccine Inoculation, Jenner has given the history and full meaning of this innovation. In the course of the investigation of this subject, which, like all others of a complex and intricate nature, presented many difficulties, I found that some of those who seem to have undergone the cowpox, nevertheless, on inoculation with the smallpox, felt its influence just the same as if no disease had been communicated to them by the cow. This occurrence led me to inquire among the medical practitioners in the country around me, all who agreed in the sentiment that the cowpox was not to be relied upon as a certain preventative of the smallpox. This for a while damped, but did not extinguish my ardor, for as I proceeded, I had the satisfaction to learn that the cow was subject to some varieties of spontaneous eruptions on her teats that were all, as I see, capable of communicating sores to the hands of the milkers, and that wherever sore was derived from the animal was called in the dairy the cowpox. Thus I surmounted a great obstacle, and in consequence was led from a distinction between these diseases, one of which only I have denominated the true, the other the spurious, cowpox, as they possess no specific powers over the constitution. In some concluding remarks in the published inquiry, Jenner relates the cases of Hannah Pick and Elizabeth Sarsenet, who contracted cowpox with all of the other servants at the farm in the parish of Berkeley. It puzzled Jenner still more to find an explanation for these cases, for Hannah resisted variolous inoculation, so the cowpox was pronounced to be true. And yet when Elizabeth Sarsenet was exposed to variolous infection, she caught the disease. This impediment to my progress was not long removed before another of far greater magnitude in its appearances started up. There were not wanting instances to prove that when the true cowpox broke out among the cattle at the dairy, a person who had milked an infected animal and had thereby apparently gone through the disease in common with others was liable to receive the smallpox afterward. This is like the former obstacle gave a painful check to my fond and aspiring hopes, but reflecting that the operations of nature are generally uniform and that it was not probable that the human constitution, having undergone the cowpox, should in some instances be perfectly shielded from the smallpox, and in many others remain unprotected, I resumed my labors with redoubled ardor. The result was fortunate, for I now discovered that the virus of the cowpox was liable to undergo progressive changes from the same causes precisely as the smallpox, and that when it was applied to the human skin in its degenerated state, It would produce the ulcerative effects as great a degree as when it was not decomposed, and sometimes far greater, but having lost its specific properties, it was incapable of producing that change upon the human frame that is requisite to render it unsusceptible of the variolous contagion, so that it became evident that a person might milk a cow one day and having caught the disease be forever secure, while another person milking the same cow the next day might feel the influence of the virus in such a way as to produce a sore or sores, and in consequence of this might experience an indisposition to a considerable extent. Yet, as has been observed, the specific quality being lost, the constitution would receive no particular impression. Jenner adds a few additional notes. He reiterates that his conviction that cowpox alone arises from the grease, and states that true cowpox was occasionally absent because the farmers' horses had not, from the dryness of the season, been affected with grease. In another paragraph, he repeats his belief that cowpox is not self-protective, and gives the case of Elizabeth Wynne, who had cowpox in 1759, was inoculated with smallpox without effect in 1797, and caught the cowpox again in 1798. Does everyone know that the only reason why Edgar March Cruikshank looked into Jenner fraud is that 100 years after his madness, there was an outbreak of cowpox in England that he went to investigate? How can it be with vaccination by cowpox that cowpox even existed? And how can it be that someone who once caught the cowpox that could protect you from a dreaded killer like smallpox could then get the cowpox? And none of this is hard to answer. It was all a fraud. The science is settled. There never was any science. In order to destroy the foundations of vaccine, quote, science, I have demonstrated that the words smallpox vaccine is a fraud. Cowpox as a disease is a fraud. Cowpox as a vaccine is a fraud. Stanford said that vaccinia used as a, quote, smallpox vaccine based on, quote, cowpox is a fraud. It is an unknown chimeric organism. Therefore, these words should be forever banned from human communication. If they're taken away, then there are no Peter Pans and Wendy's to talk about as if they were nonfiction characters to affect our physical universe. They are frauds, and as such they should be banned, but that leaves nothing in their place except unknown pus. Therefore, the very foundations of vaccine science crumbles under the weight of two words: unknown pus. I mean, seriously, am I the only fucker on the planet that ever did the deconstruction on the words? Words are spells. There has been a spell cast with words that those who exerted power thrust upon their victims, who then assumed that their controllers knew what it meant. Because the herd abdicated their personal authority to those usurpers, the herd didn't know what those words meant. So a 221-year history of a spell being unchallenged at the most rudimentary level of the spell itself says that either I am a fucking genius or the whole world is not fit to survive. Jenner and his maniac minions never stopped at cowpox, but went on to use any pus they could get their hands on, whether it came from sheep, goats, or even kosher pigs. From History and Pathology of Vaccination, Volume 2, we're going to need a forensic English language, grammar, and syntax specialist on this one. Observations on the relations which exist between smallpox and cowpox. Communicated to the Academy of Medicine, September 5th, 1865. Among the variolae of animals which can be transmitted to man, there may be mentioned as an example the hog pox, variolae de cochon, of which Count Lorguis, having it appears, witnessed a case of such transmission and anticipated Jenner by nearly half a century, proposed to the Academy of Sciences to practice prophylactic inoculation on man. It is asserted that the discovery of vaccination inoculated his own son in this way. So what does that say to you? Since conspiracy theory is the heart of criminal law, I have a mind that filters for conspiracy. The passage opens with a reference to swine or hog pox. Then it goes on to say, quote, "It is asserted that the discoverer of vaccination inoculated his son in this way." This is where we need the forensics. We see from the chart above that Jenner's nephew Henry inoculated Robert Jenner, supposedly with human pus that came from a cow that came from a horse. Let us pause for a moment to consider yet another fraud. The narratives all say that Jenner inoculated his son with cowpox. This is problematic from the start. He had two sons. Which son? Isn't that why they invented names? If we presume, and we will find out that we can't, that this passage was referring to Robert, then this is a double lie. When a witness has been shown to lie, then their testimony is to be thrown out. The lie begins, Jenner inoculated his son with cowpox. Jenner didn't inoculate Robert. Jenner's nephew Henry inoculated Robert. Henry didn't inoculate Robert with cowpox. He used the pus from William Summers through William Peed through Hannah Excel. This has to be thrown out of court. The courts must find themselves guilty of conspiracy of crimes against the biosphere. The courts must be disbanded forever. We'll get to the heart of this below, but like one of those news magazine crime shows where they don't give you all the facts until the end, you remain confused and ready to hang the wrong person. They all need hanging, but we need to set the record straight. The cryptic line earlier indicates to me that Jenner inoculated an unidentified son with swinepox. I can see no other way to interpret it. I do not doubt Cruikshank or his accurate transcription of Jenner's primary source documents. I just doubt what was in those documents had anything to do with reality. This is neither the first nor the last time that our neighbors across the channel have taught us to put our ideas into practice. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, Yearbook of Agriculture, 1956, Animal Diseases states categorically that swinepox and variola vaccinae, aka cowpox, are not mutually protective. Page 385, quote, "Swinepox is caused by a pox virus that is thought to affect only swine. The disease is not generally considered as being transmitted from animal to animal by contact, but is easily carried from affected pigs to unaffected pigs by lice. Swine that recover from the disease are immune to further attacks. Swine are not susceptible to the viruses causing pox in other species of animals except vaccinia virus, the virus used for vaccination against smallpox. Vaccinia virus produces a disease with skin lesions on pigs, much like those produced by swinepox virus. The outstanding differences are the more superficial location of the pox lesions and their earlier disappearance. Swine that recover from vaccinia infection are permanently immune to that disease, but remain susceptible to swinepox. Swine that are immune to swinepox are still susceptible to vaccinia. No medical treatment is known for swinepox. Good care and general sanitary measures are recommended for controlling the disease and preventing complications." The Nelson Mandela effect is the latest mimetic war waged on adults, now showing the signs of vaccine-induced autism late in life. With the NSA construct of wicked PETA on us, able to rewrite history for a world that accepts a labile electronic format of information as an authority, it is very easy to imagine a recent future where Wikipedia will say that 3 quarts make a gallon, and everyone will agree that it's always been that way. And that those crisscrosses in the sky have always been there because not only did they see the chemtrails in the Pixar movie Cars, but also digitally added to Casablanca with Bogart and Bergen. So it was with this constant pressure to disbelieve everything and the harsh reality that my facts had to be fact-checked before issuing an arrest warrant on fraud and murder that I spent 4 hours downloading and searching Life of Edward Jenner, MD, LLD, FRS, Physician Extraordinary to the King, and etc., with illustrations of his doctrines and selections from his correspondence by John Barron, MD, FRS, London, Henry Colburn, New Burlington Street, 1827, starting at page 129. I searched Barron's biography of Jenner so that I could prove out what I already knew to be true in my mind, but had to be set with an authority that the vaccine polluters worship, and one that the courts could not deny without putting into question their entire house of cards. This is the beauty of Cruikshank using Jenner's own work to prove the fraud, and when we use the CDC to show that it, as a military operation, has been using fraud to commit murder as well, which is an international crime because war itself is a crime. Let's see what Mr. Barron had to say that confirms that my memory is sound and that at least to this point in time the hysterical record hasn't changed. There is quite a bit of confusion out there amongst the well-intentioned folks who stand against bioweapons as to what happened with baby Jenner. Edward Junior was Edward Jenner's oldest son that Barron had said was never well. Junior died at the age of 21. His eldest son, Edward, who had a feeble constitution and other infirmities, which rendered it inexpedient to send him to public school, received all his education under his father's roof. So whereas I have stated publicly, based on confusing accounts, that Jenner vaccinated his infant son with swinepox, and then that son was not quite right afterwards, leading to a presumption of the first case of autism from a vaccine, we now find that some of the supposed facts are mistaken, a legal word, and that the problem remains unresolved. Edward Jr. may indeed have been damaged by variolation and something else, but Edward Jr. was never vaccinated. No one can say what messed the kid's mud pellet. It can be said that Edward died a lingering and horrible death of pulmonary tuberculosis to the point of spitting up blood. TB is easily contracted by scratching unknown pus from a human or animal into another human. To assist in this object, a domestic tutor was procured. The youth who was selected for this purpose was but little older than his pupil, but though tender in years, he was old in wisdom and knowledge. This extraordinary boy, John Dawes Worgan, became an inmate of Dr. Jenner's family at Berkeley in September 1806, having not then completed his 16th year. He had 2 attacks of typhus fever while under Dr. Jenner's roof, and he was finally destroyed by pulmonary consumption in 1809. This is where the shit science hits the fan. The entire reason for the Linnaeus binomial nomenclature was to avoid the confusion like what we are seeing here. Typhus is a group of diseases caused by lice, rat fleas, rat mites called chiggers, and rickettsia, giving louse-borne typhus including Brill's disease, murine typhus, scrub typhus, and Q fever. All of them cause fever. But, and this was the theme of this deposition of evidence of crimes. Typhoid fever, also called enteric fever, is from Salmonella typhi, a bacteria that likes to invade your macrophages and live inside your liver. A rat shit liver. Once again, we can presume what Jenner and Barron and all of the thinkers of that time thought typhus fever was, but in the absence of any clearly defined scientific words and no laboratory clinical evidence, it doesn't mean rat shit to us. Well, it could, but we'll never know. It seems that the Jenner household was a hot box for TB infections. You really got to love the word inmate. During the latter part of his stay in London, his mind was much agitated by the situation of his family at Berkeley. His eldest son was suffering under typhus, and he found him, on his return home, quite a wreck, and with little hope of recovery. His second son was seized with the same disease, and his situation became extremely perilous. So, if it was so goddamn easy to take pus from a cow's tit and save the fucking world, then why didn't Eddy take some rat shit, put it in a wound on somebody's arm with a lancet, and declare them free of typhus forever? Seriously, I'm not shitting. If it was as simple as the fantasy surrounding the origins of vaccination as officially promoted, then Jenner's mentor, John Hunter, should not have gotten gonorrhea. He should have been immune to it. Our second interview took place in his own house at Berkeley. His eldest son, Edward, was then lying in the last state of pulmonary consumption. He had repeated hemorrhages from the lungs and was evidently approaching his end. Dr. Perry of Bath was in the house. I was introduced into the sick room and there for the first time saw Mrs. Jenner, the anxious and constant attendant on her dying child. Jenner also had a daughter, Catherine Sarah. Jenner's youngest child was Robert Fitzharding, around whom the second round of confusing quote-unquote facts swirl. Vaxopedia smugly claims that the notion that Robert was vaccinated and got autism is debunked. Robert died at the age of 56, as opposed to his sickly brother Edward, who died at 21. And it was Edward who was neurologically damaged. We've already been teased with the notion from Cruikshank's citation that Father Jenner was playing around with kosher pig pus on an unidentified son. Now, if you might be wondering why I always refer to it as being kosher pig, well, if you are as intelligent and inventive as me, then you would be wondering, and rightly so, why haven't Muslims and Jews declared jihad on vaccines? And if you are as intelligent and as inventive as me, then you would have done something simple that I reported to my list in an email. It's always been as simple as this. Keywords: porcine ingredients, vaccines. And it comes up with a link on gelatin, with search terms also leading to porcine vaccine approval. Kosher pigs, man. It says so right there. Of course, that is the price you pay when you let anyone tell you what to do. So let's let Barron take us to the bottom of the pork barrel. Some of the facts which I have presented on authority of Mr. Gardner were given by him in evidence before a committee of the House of Commons, when a most extraordinary and preposterous attempt was made to strip Dr. Jenner of his well-earned reputation and to deprive him of his not less merited reward. We pause briefly to establish means, motive, and opportunity of crime because after the fraud was accepted by government, from Cruikshank, the Royal College of Physicians have received their commands, applied themselves to the inquiry, and corresponded with the colleges of physicians in Dublin and Edinburgh, the colleges of surgeons in London, Edinburgh, and Dublin, and having reported in favor of Dr. Jenner, the question of a further grant was put to the House, and £20,000 was agreed to by the majority of 13. That's 1,626,685.01 in adjusted 2011 dollars. That's a hefty sum for a country doctor who was appointed director of the National Vaccine Establishment. From Barron, the board appointed him director, but they soon contrived to let him feel like he was a director directed. Like all figureheads in a public position but having no control over their puppet strings, this was just a 220-year-old shuck and jive by the elders of Zion. So while we are on the topic of the Yahudim manipulating their lesser brethren, let's get back to that kosher pork thing. From Barron. While deliberating on the subject of vaccine inoculation, he made some experiments regarding the nature of swine pox, as it is vulgarly called. From facts elsewhere detailed, it has been found reasonable to conclude that this disease, as well as the common variolas and the variolated vaccinated, had one common origin and were, in fact, varieties of the same affection. The circumstances which I am now to mention affords a strong corroboration and moreover forms a striking incident in the history which I am endeavoring to unfold. Because my facts are rapid and the presentation may seem convoluted in an attempt to unconvolute them, let me remind you again about what the USDA had to say about the swine pox and vaccinia. Swine are not susceptible to the viruses causing pox in other species of animals, except vaccinia virus, the virus used for vaccination against smallpox. Do you see? Please tell me that you see the word game, the spell that has everyone caught up in arguing how many pinheads can dance on an angel. The USDA perpetuates the fraud in that they talk about vaccinia as a vaccination against smallpox. Vaccinia was called cow smallpox, variolated vaccinated. Yet Stanford, remember them, said that vaccinia had nothing whatsoever to do with cowpox or smallpox. So 220 years of saying that cowpox virus was used to protect against smallpox is a lie, a fraud. It is clearly stated that swine are not susceptible to cowpox virus. This is more nails in the coffin of the nomenclature that is at the heart of this criminal case. If we accept the USDA pronouncement that swine can get both viruses but neither is mutually protective, then Barron's claim regarding the history of Jenner's experiments is a fraud. From facts elsewhere detailed, it has been found reasonable to conclude that this disease, as well as the common variolas and the variola vaccinated, had one common origin and were in fact varieties of the same affection. It's just wrong. It's a lie. It's a fraud. The science is settled. There was no science. This is fiat consensus. It is as we say because we say it is. In November of 1789, he inoculated his eldest son, Edward, who was then about 1 year and a half old, with swine pox matter. This is where I apologize and set the record straight. I was mistaken that the swine pox was inoculated into his youngest son, Robert, and that was why the child was recorded as having never been well. We see here that with an inversion of 9 years between 1789 and 1798, that Jenner was already polluting Edward Junior, who was that boy that was never right with something that didn't have a goddamn thing to do with milkmaids or milk unless you can milk a pig of pus. The progress of the disease seems similar to that which arises from the insertion of true smallpox matter when the disease is very slight. He sickened on the 8th day. A few pustules appeared. They were late and slow in their progress and small. Variolous matter was carefully inserted into his arms at 5 or 6 different periods without the slightest inflammation being excited in the part. On Thursday, April 7th, 1791, variolous matter was again inserted by 2 small incisions through the cutis. 9th, evidently inflamed. 10th, an efflorescence of the size of a shilling spread around the inferior wound. 11th, the incision assumed a kind of erysipelatous elevation, the efflorescence much increased. 12th, these appearances much advanced. 13th, a vesicle containing a brownish fluid and transparent, about the size of a large split pea on the superior incision, the inferior about twice as big, the surrounding parts affected with erysipelas. The erysipelas extended to the shoulder and then pretty quickly went off. The child showed no signs of indisposition the whole time. March 1792, E. Jenner was again inoculated. The matter was taken from a child that had caught the disease in the natural way and had it pretty full. It was inserted fresh from the pustule. The same evening, an inflammation appeared around the incision, which at the end of 24 hours increased the diameter of a sixpence, and some fluid had already been collecting on the lips of the scratch, which the child had rubbed off. So it was indeed the 1.5-year-old Eddy Junior in 1789 that got the kosher pork experiment and was followed by supposed smallpox challenge in 1791 and then 1792. It was Eddy Junior who wasn't quite right afterwards. A later Barron commentary. One of the former is of an individual who, having been infected from the heel of a horse, afterwards completely resisted smallpox contagion. Among the latter is mentioned the case of his second son, Robert Fitzharding Jenner, an infant 11 months old, and of several other children who were vaccinated on the 12th of April, 1798, with the matter taken from the arm of Hannah Axel. It is particularly specified that Robert Jenner did not receive the infection. What you were just treated to is Barron's account that Jenner's nephew, Henry, scratched unknown pus 4 steps removed from its source into Jenner's youngest son, but it didn't, quote, take. This is what set the madman on a flurry of insane speculations of when is cowpox not cowpox, when it is a pox on the cow. Thus his theory of spurious cowpox was born. Barron goes on to feature a public criticism of Jenner that leads to yet more admissions of failures, despite Barron's religious apologetics for his fiendish friend. Barron, Volume 2. Dr. Ramsden, rector of Grundisburg, Suffolk, in a note to a sermon preached before the University of Cambridge on May 15, 1803, states that he heard with his own ears in the physic school of the university. The King's reader of physic said that Dr. Jenner had, after the discovery of vaccination, inoculated his own son with the smallpox. This sermon, together with the note, was reprinted in 1827. The King's reader on physic, Sir Isaac Pennington, was a violent opposer of vaccination, and he put forward his statement with a view to prove that Dr. Jenner, though he recommended the practice to others, was distrustful of it and had abandoned it in his own family. It was for the purpose of representing Jenner in this light that the statement was uttered and printed and circulated throughout the kingdom. I do not blame the rector of Grundisburg for repeating in 1803 what he may have heard from the King's reader in physic, but before giving a second edition of the tale in 1827, it would not have been unworthy of his station and his calling to ascertain whether the information he had heard was founded in truth or rested on a basis of a different description, whether Dr. Jenner or his friends had published any explanation of the alleged delinquency, and whether, in short, or the real state of the case was not in direct opposition to the inferences which were drawn from it. The facts were these. On the 14th of May, 1796, Jenner vaccinated his first patient, Phipps. On the 12th of April, 1798, he vaccinated his son, Robert, together with several other children. It is particularly specified in his first publication that his son, Robert, quote, did not receive the infection. He was therefore as much liable to the influence of smallpox contagion as if he had never been vaccinated. Under these circumstances, while the infant was with his parents at Cheltenham, the late Mr. Cawthor of that place came to Jenner's house and took the child in his arms, saying that he had just left a family laboring under smallpox. Jenner immediately exclaimed, "Sir, you know not what you are doing. That child is not protected. He was vaccinated, but the infection failed." Believing that the natural smallpox would certainly follow this exposure, he was greatly distressed and alarmed. He had no vaccine matter. He resolved, therefore, to adopt the next best expedient and immediately have the child inoculated with smallpox virus, preferring the mitigation which that practice affords to the violence and danger which is generally accompanied by casual disease. This simple occurrence, when related as it actually took place, so far from leading to the conclusions that were built upon it, did not afford the slightest ground for them. It was a clear case of professional duty, and under like circumstances, every medical man would have been called on to act as Jenner did. He had no vaccine matter. His child was exposed to smallpox contagion. And what therefore did he do? Smallpox in some shape seemed inevitable, and he sought for that abatement of its virulence which inoculation is known to afford. At the time the deed was perpetrated, everyone who knew the truth was so perfectly satisfied with the soundness and propriety of Jenner's decision that it never was imagined that it could be questioned. The bare fact, however, that Dr. Jenner had employed smallpox inoculation in his own family after the publication of his work on the variola vaccinae was an incident too important to be lost sight of by those who were unfriendly to him and to vaccination. Quote, "Dr. Jenner may say what he likes about vaccination, but we know for certain that he has inoculated his own son with smallpox." Another repeated the statement with this addition, that he had done so because he mistrusted vaccination. A third added another tint to deepen the color, affirming that he knew that Dr. Jenner had abandoned his confidence in vaccination, and the proof is incontestable, as he has inoculated his own son with smallpox. From Jenner's own letter. My two eldest children were inoculated for smallpox before I began to inoculate for the cowpox. My youngest child was born about the time my experiments commenced and was among the earliest I ever vaccinated. By referring to the first work I published on the subject in the spring of the year 1798, page 40, you will find his name, Robert F. Jenner, and you will observe it noticed that on his arm the vaccine lymph did not prove infectious. It advanced 2 or 3 days and then died away. In a short time after, I was necessitated to go with my family to Cheltenham for a few months, where I did not think it prudent to resume my operations, from a supposition that the people assembled at the public watering place might conceive the disease, then so little known, to be contagious, and that it might excite a clamor. However, during my stay there, this boy was accidentally exposed to the smallpox, and in such a way as to leave no doubt on my mind of his being infected. Having at this time no vaccine matter in my possession, there was no alternative but his immediate inoculation, which was done by Mr. Cawthor a surgeon in this place who is since dead, but this history is well known to many who are living. You now see on what baseless foundation the insinuations which have been published respecting these facts rest. Believe me, my dear doctor, with much affection, truly yours, Edward Jenner, Cheltenham, 6th November, 1810. What does this exchange tell us? That the other 8 people who were polluted with unknown pus were declared to be protected against smallpox by the corruption they were given, so it could not be laid at the feet of Jenner's invented spurious cowpox. His son Robert didn't, quote, take the vaccine lymph, whatever the fuck that means, since vaccine lymph is an undefined, unsubstantiated, unscientific phrase. But if it took for all the other victims, then why didn't it take in Robert? If he was vaccinated, then why didn't it protect him at any level? Why was Jenner scared to death of his kid getting smallpox when he was the world's greatest defeater of smallpox? And since he thought smallpox variolation and its well-known risks, including death, were supposed to be improved upon by vaccination, then why didn't vaccination suffice for little Bobby? Why did Jenner resort to the rabies scam of giving a vaccine for a disease already acquired? Maybe Pasteur and all that followed learned their tricks from Fast Eddy. Show us the logic. Show us the science that proves that once a disease is acquired naturally, that somehow getting a vaccine magically protects you from the already acquired disease. Once you get an infection, it will be in the bloodstream, so why would an immune system be at a disadvantage to mount a defense slower than cutting it into the bloodstream unnaturally? We don't even know the status of Bobby's immune system. What if the variolation didn't take? Nervous Eddy was prepared for his variolation by 6 weeks of torture and starvation, yet baby Eddy got the pus cut right into him on the spot. Also, what kind of fuck would cradle a kid of a fellow doctor and then admit that he'd just come from a prostitute that had Ebola? Too many questions directed at a fantasy that cannot be answered in reality. Fraud and murder have no statute of limitations. There is an unbroken history of both from before Jenner until this day that also demonstrates conspiracy of malice aforethought. What's that? I think I hear the assembly of gallows.